The deepest wounds are rarely caused by strangers. They come from the people you once believed would always protect your heart. The day my daughter looked at me across her kitchen table and quietly said, "Mom, maybe it is time you stopped depending on us," something inside me became perfectly still. She did not raise her voice. She did not sound angry. She simply sounded tired, as though carrying me had become another monthly bill she could no longer afford. I wrapped both hands around my warm coffee mug and smiled gently because I knew arguing would change nothing. The truth was sitting silently between us, but only one of us could see it. Emily stood and began stacking breakfast dishes while rushing through another busy morning before work. My granddaughter, Sophie, hugged me goodbye before leaving for school, whispering that she would help me finish planting the autumn flowers that afternoon. She was the only person in the house who still looked at me without measuring my worth. David kissed Emily on the cheek, gathered his briefcase, and reminded everyone about another mortgage payment due the following week. I quietly wished them a good day and watched the front door close behind them. The house became peaceful again. I walked slowly through the small guest cottage behind Emily's home where I had lived since my husband passed away 5 years earlier. It was comfortable, filled with familiar photographs, old books, and the rocking chair my late husband had built with his own hands. Emily believed I stayed there because I could not afford anything else. I had never corrected her. Some misunderstandings become too heavy to untangle once they have lived long enough. Every morning followed nearly the same routine. I watered the garden, folded laundry, prepared dinner before everyone returned home, and made sure Sophie's favorite cookies were cooling on the kitchen counter after school. I never asked for anything except the chance to remain close to my family. That afternoon I drove my aging sedan across town to the small community bank, just as I had quietly done on the first Tuesday of every month for many years. The tellers greeted me by name with warm smiles. They knew me well enough not to ask unnecessary questions. After signing a few familiar documents, I handed the manager a sealed white envelope. He carefully placed it inside a confidential file before nodding respectfully. "Everything will continue exactly as you requested, Mrs. Wilson," he said. I thanked him and walked back to my car beneath rows of golden maple trees without explaining why those monthly visits mattered. Some promises are meant to remain invisible until the right moment arrives. That evening Emily returned home looking exhausted. She barely touched her dinner before opening a notebook filled with household expenses. I quietly washed the dishes while she spoke to David about rising insurance costs, utility bills, grocery prices, and college savings for Sophie. Then she sighed heavily and spoke the words that settled over the room like cold rain. "I honestly do not know how much longer we can afford to keep taking care of Mom." I stood silently at the sink with my back turned toward them. A single tear slipped down my cheek, not because her words hurt, but because she truly believed they were true. The next morning arrived with the quiet rhythm that had shaped my life for longer than anyone seemed to notice. Before the first light reached the maple trees outside my window, I was already awake, folding the blanket at the foot of my bed and whispering the same simple prayer I had spoken every day since my husband passed away. I thanked God for another sunrise, another chance to love my family even if they no longer understood what love sometimes looked like. By 6 o'clock, the smell of fresh biscuits filled the kitchen. I cracked eggs into a bowl, brewed a pot of coffee, sliced fresh fruit, and packed Sophie's lunch before anyone else came downstairs. Emily hurried into the kitchen with her phone pressed against her ear, answering emails while searching for her car keys. She smiled politely at me without really seeing me. David grabbed a piece of toast, thanked me quickly, and rushed out the door after reminding Emily about another meeting at the office. Sophie was the last to appear, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. She wrapped her arms around my waist and whispered that my pancakes were better than anyone else's. Her words warmed my heart more than she could ever imagine. After everyone left, I quietly cleaned the kitchen, watered the flowers along the front porch, and gathered the fallen maple leaves into neat piles. Neighbors often waved as they passed by, always commenting on how beautiful Emily's yard looked. I simply smiled and thanked them. No one realized that every flower blooming beside the walkway had been planted by my hands over the past 5 years. Later that afternoon, I sat beneath the old maple tree in the backyard while Sophie finished her homework beside me. She looked up from her notebook and asked the innocent question only a child could ask. "Grandma, why do you always smile even when Mommy seems upset?" I brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face and answered softly, "Because love is not measured by how people treat us. Love is measured by how faithfully we choose to care for them anyway." Sophie thought quietly before nodding, although I knew she was still too young to fully understand. As the evening settled over the neighborhood, I prepared dinner once again. Emily arrived home exhausted, carrying grocery bags and another folder filled with bills. She spread the papers across the dining table, adding numbers together with growing frustration. I heard her quietly tell David that everything seemed more expensive every month and that they would have to start making difficult decisions. Neither of them noticed me placing a fresh loaf of homemade bread beside their plates. I quietly excused myself after dinner and returned to my little cottage. On the small wooden shelf beside my favorite chair rested a worn photograph of my late husband. I picked it up, smiling at the familiar face that had always made every burden seem lighter. "You always believed the truth would find its own way," I whispered. Just then my telephone rang. The caller identification displayed the name James Porter. It was unusual for my attorney to call after sunset. I answered calmly, and before I could even say hello, his gentle voice carried a quiet urgency. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, "there has been an unexpected request concerning your trust account. I think you should come to my office first thing tomorrow morning." The following morning arrived beneath a sky covered with soft gray clouds as I drove across town toward James Porter's law office. The familiar brick building stood beside the courthouse square, unchanged for decades, just like the man waiting inside. James greeted me with the same respectful smile he had offered ever since my husband first introduced us more than 20 years earlier. He closed the office door behind us, invited me to sit, and placed a thick cream-colored folder on his polished oak desk. His expression was calm, but I could sense something unusual behind his eyes. "Mrs. Wilson," he began gently, "yesterday afternoon someone contacted the bank asking detailed questions about the trust account. They did not gain access to any confidential information, but they seemed determined to learn whether the monthly distributions would continue." I looked quietly at the folder before me without saying a word. James had promised my husband that every instruction inside those documents would remain private unless I personally decided otherwise. He slid the folder toward me. Inside were copies of familiar papers bearing my signature, cancelled checks dating back nearly 15 years, and carefully organized payment records. Every mortgage payment, every tuition bill, every insurance premium, every unexpected medical expense had been documented with extraordinary precision. Looking at those pages felt like opening a diary written not with words but with silent acts of love. James spoke softly again. "No one outside this office and the bank knows the complete picture. Emily has never requested access because she has always believed these payments came from ordinary household income." I smiled sadly. She never asked because she never imagined there was another answer. James nodded. "Would you like me to tell her?" I slowly shook my head. "Not yet. Truth loses some of its meaning when it arrives before people are ready to receive it." He respected my decision without another question. Before leaving, I signed the routine authorization that allowed the monthly transfers to continue exactly as they always had. As I walked back toward my car, the autumn wind carried golden maple leaves across the sidewalk, reminding me how quietly seasons changed while people rarely noticed until the trees stood completely bare. On the drive home, I stopped at the grocery store to buy Sophie's favorite apples, fresh cinnamon, and a small pumpkin she had admired the week before. Life had taught me that love often looked like ordinary errands no one remembered. That evening Emily came home later than usual. She looked exhausted, dropping her purse onto the kitchen counter before opening another stack of unpaid invoices. David rubbed his forehead while studying their checking account on his laptop. Their conversation grew quieter than usual, filled with worried whispers about rising expenses, another unexpected repair bill, and the cost of Sophie's upcoming school trip. I quietly placed warm apple pie on the table without interrupting them. Emily thanked me politely, but her eyes never left the columns of numbers spread across the table. As I carried my empty coffee cup back toward the sink, I overheard her say something that stopped me for only a heartbeat. If we cannot reduce our expenses soon, we may have to start making choices none of us want to make. I continued washing the dishes as though I had heard nothing at all, but deep inside I realized that the quiet promise I had protected for 15 years was slowly approaching the moment when it could no longer remain hidden. The days that followed settled into an uneasy routine, as though every member of the family could sense an approaching storm without seeing a single cloud. I continued waking before sunrise, preparing breakfast, tending the garden, and making certain Sophie left for school with a full lunch and a warm hug. Emily seemed more distracted each morning. She barely tasted her coffee before rushing out the door, and even David's quiet optimism had begun to fade beneath the weight of unpaid bills and endless calculations. One evening, after dinner, I carried a basket of folded laundry toward my little cottage behind the house. The windows of the main house were slightly open, allowing the cool autumn breeze to drift through the rooms. As I stepped onto the porch, I heard Emily's voice floating from the dining room. She sounded exhausted rather than angry. "We cannot keep living like this," she said softly. "Something has to change." David answered in an equally tired voice. "I know. I have been reviewing everything. We have already cut vacations, restaurants, and unnecessary spending." There was a long silence before Emily spoke again. "Maybe it is time we seriously think about moving Mom into an assisted living community. She would have people around her all day, and we could finally get our finances under control." I stood perfectly still outside the screen door. The basket remained balanced in my hands, but my heart suddenly felt much heavier than the clean towels inside it. David did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried uncertainty. "She has always been good to us." Emily sighed. "I know she has. I love her. But love does not pay bills. We simply cannot afford everything anymore." I quietly turned away before either of them noticed I had been standing there. There was no anger inside me, only a deep sadness that they believed I was the expense pulling them beneath the water instead of the unseen hand that had kept them afloat for years. Back inside my cottage, I sat in the old rocking chair my husband had built decades earlier. The familiar creak of the wood echoed gently through the room as I looked toward the small wooden keepsake box resting on the bookshelf. Beside it lay a brass key attached to a faded leather tag. My husband had once placed that key in my hand and said, "When the day comes that our family forgets where their blessings began, promise me you will let the truth speak for itself." I had kept that promise for 15 years. I reached for the telephone and dialed James Porter's private number. He answered almost immediately. "Good evening, Mrs. Wilson." I closed my eyes before speaking. "James, I believe the time has come to prepare the trust for its next stage." He remained silent for a moment, understanding exactly what those words meant. "Are you certain?" he asked gently. I looked through the window toward the warmly lit house where my daughter believed she was carrying me through life. "Yes," I whispered. "Do not reveal anything yet. But begin preparing every document exactly as my husband instructed. The truth is almost ready to introduce itself." The following week unfolded with a quiet tension that settled over the house like the first frost of late autumn. Emily spent every evening searching online for ways to reduce expenses. She compared insurance plans, clipped grocery coupons, canceled another streaming subscription, and even postponed repairing the aging family car. No matter how many numbers she adjusted, the total at the bottom of each page never seemed to shrink enough. I continued my familiar routine without mentioning the conversation I had overheard. Every morning I prepared breakfast, packed Sophie's lunch, and left a handwritten note inside her lunchbox reminding her how proud I was of her. She collected every note inside a small box beneath her bed, believing one day she would read them to her own children. One Saturday afternoon Emily asked if I would watch Sophie while she and David visited several assisted living communities on the other side of town. She tried to sound cheerful as she explained they were simply gathering information for the future. I smiled warmly and told her not to worry about us. Sophie looked confused when they left, asking why her parents wanted to visit places where older people lived. I gently changed the subject, suggesting we bake cinnamon cookies together instead. While the cookies cooled on the kitchen counter, Sophie curled beside me on the sofa with a library book. "Grandma," she asked quietly, "would you ever want to live somewhere else?" I looked toward the backyard where the maple leaves drifted softly through the afternoon sunlight. "Home is never only a building," I answered. "Home is wherever the people you love remember that you belong." She rested her head against my shoulder without saying another word. Late that evening Emily and David returned looking emotionally drained. They believed I had already gone to bed, but I remained awake in my cottage reading beside the window. Through the quiet night air I heard their voices carrying from the patio outside the main house. Emily sounded discouraged. "Every place we visited costs far more than I expected. I do not know how families afford this." David replied softly, "Neither do I, but something still has to change." I closed my book and quietly reached for the telephone. James Porter answered after the second ring. "Good evening, Mrs. Wilson." "James," I said calmly, "I would like to meet you on Monday morning." "Of course," he replied. "Should I prepare the trust amendment?" I looked across the dark backyard toward the lights glowing inside my daughter's home. "Yes," I answered with complete certainty. "Continue exactly as my husband instructed. I do not want to remove Emily from anything. I simply want the monthly distributions to end after this month." There was a respectful silence before James spoke again. "Once the payments stop, they will begin asking questions." "I know," I whispered. "For 15 years I protected my family by remaining invisible. Perhaps the only way to protect them now is to let them discover what invisible love truly looked like." After ending the call, I opened the small wooden keepsake box resting beside my rocking chair. Inside lay the brass key, several family photographs, and one sealed white envelope addressed in my husband's careful handwriting. I gently touched the envelope but did not open it. Its time had not yet arrived, but for the first time in many years, I could feel that day drawing very near. Monday morning arrived with a crisp breeze that carried the scent of fallen maple leaves through the quiet streets of our little town. I drove to James Porter's office just after sunrise, carrying only my handbag and the brass key that had remained in my possession since the day my husband placed it in my palm. James welcomed me into the conference room where the familiar cream-colored folder already rested on the polished wooden table. Every document had been prepared exactly as we had discussed. He carefully reviewed each page before sliding the final amendment toward me. "Nothing about the beneficiaries has changed," he said gently. "Emily will still receive everything exactly as your husband intended. The only change is that the monthly distributions from the trust will end after the final payment this week." I quietly read every page before signing my name with the same fountain pen my husband had once used. My hand remained steady. This decision was not made out of disappointment or anger. It was made because the truth had reached the moment where it could no longer remain hidden behind silent generosity. James placed the signed documents back inside the folder with great care. "Once the automatic transfers stop, someone will almost certainly contact the bank." I nodded calmly. "Let them ask their questions. They deserve honest answers when the time comes. Just not today." Before leaving, James handed me a sealed white envelope bearing my husband's handwriting. He instructed me to give you this only after the amendment was complete. I held the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The familiar handwriting immediately brought tears to my eyes. "If you are reading this," he had written, "our family has reached the day we prepared for together. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Love sometimes protects by giving, but it also protects by allowing others to discover what they never bothered to see." Trust the truth. It will accomplish what anger never could. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the brass key inside my handbag. As I drove home, I stopped at the neighborhood bakery to buy Sophie's favorite cinnamon rolls. She had a science presentation that afternoon, and I wanted her to know someone was celebrating her courage. When I returned home, the house was empty except for the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock. I placed the pastries on the counter and began preparing dinner as though nothing had changed. That evening Emily arrived looking more exhausted than I had ever seen her. She thanked me for making dinner before sitting at the dining table with another stack of bills. David joined her a few minutes later, opening his laptop while comparing figures from their checking account. They spoke in tired whispers about next month's expenses, unaware that the final automatic payment from the trust had already been scheduled earlier that morning. I carried everyone's empty plates into the kitchen and quietly washed them beneath the warm running water. Outside the window, the last light of sunset disappeared behind the maple trees. Somewhere beyond the peaceful silence, the unseen clock that had protected my family for 15 years had begun counting down its final days. 3 days later the quiet routine that had held our family together for years began to unravel in ways no one expected. I was watering the chrysanthemums along the front walkway when I heard the front door open much earlier than usual. Emily stepped inside carrying her briefcase, but instead of greeting me she hurried directly to the dining room with her phone pressed tightly against her ear. Her voice was calm at first, then slowly filled with confusion. "There must be some mistake," she said. "Our mortgage payment has always been processed automatically." A long silence followed before she spoke again. "No, I never cancelled anything." She lowered the phone and stared blankly at the paperwork spread across the dining table. Less than an hour later David arrived home after receiving an urgent message from Emily. The two of them sat together reviewing their online banking records again and again, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. I quietly continued preparing dinner, pretending not to notice the growing tension filling the house. Before the evening meal was even finished, Emily's phone rang again. This time it was Sophie's private school. Tuition for the upcoming semester had not been received by the scheduled deadline. Emily apologized repeatedly, promising the payment would be made immediately. She looked embarrassed, insisting there had to be a banking error. David opened another account statement while calculating available funds. Their savings would barely cover the overdue mortgage, leaving almost nothing for tuition, insurance, and the unexpected medical bill that had arrived earlier that week. The numbers no longer fit together the way they always had. The invisible support beneath their lives had quietly disappeared. The following morning another letter arrived in the mailbox. It was a notice from their health insurance provider explaining that the most recent premium had not been received. Emily read the letter twice before placing it beside the growing stack of unpaid notices. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Every one of these payments has always gone through." David frowned as he compared records from previous years. "I cannot find where these payments were actually coming from," he admitted. "They are not connected to any account we own." His words hung silently in the room. Emily shook her head in disbelief. "That cannot be right." I remained seated near the kitchen window, quietly peeling apples for another pie while listening without interrupting. Sophie walked into the room after school and immediately sensed the heavy silence. She looked from her parents to me before asking if everything was all right. Emily forced a smile and assured her they were simply solving a financial problem. Sophie nodded but continued watching everyone with the careful eyes of a child who understood far more than adults often believed. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I stepped outside beneath the clear autumn sky. The maple leaves rustled softly around the old garden where my husband and I had once dreamed about the family we hoped would always remain close. I held the brass key tightly inside my pocket and whispered a quiet prayer that the coming days would not harden anyone's heart. The truth had finally begun its gentle work, and for the first time in 15 years, my family was starting to notice the silence left behind by a love they had never realized was carrying them every single month. The next several days became a blur of unanswered questions and growing uncertainty. Every morning Emily sat at the dining room table before leaving for work, surrounded by stacks of bank statements, insurance notices, tuition invoices, and handwritten calculations that never seemed to produce the answer she desperately wanted. David spent every evening searching through years of digital financial records. Convinced that some forgotten automatic payment or hidden account would eventually explain why everything had suddenly stopped at exactly the same time. Instead, the deeper he searched, the stranger the mystery became. One Thursday evening he called their local bank and requested a complete transaction history covering the past several years. The representative patiently reviewed every checking account, savings account, retirement fund, and credit line connected to their names. When the conversation ended, David slowly lowered the telephone and looked toward Emily with genuine confusion. "Those payments never came from us," he said quietly. Emily stared at him as though she had misunderstood what he had just said. "What do you mean they never came from us?" David turned his laptop toward her, pointing to a spreadsheet he had created after comparing every account they owned. "Our mortgage, Sophie's tuition, the health insurance premiums, and even several medical bills were paid by recurring electronic transfers that never originated from any account registered to us. I cannot trace where the money actually came from." Emily shook her head firmly. "That cannot be possible. We have lived in this house for years." David rubbed his forehead. "That is exactly why I cannot understand it." Their conversation continued late into the evening while I quietly finished folding laundry in the living room. Neither of them noticed that my hands briefly paused when David mentioned the anonymous transfers. The time for hidden kindness was ending exactly as my husband had predicted many years ago. The following afternoon Sophie returned home carrying a family history assignment from school. She cheerfully explained that every student had been asked to bring old photographs or keepsakes representing their family's story. "Grandma," she asked with a bright smile, "do you have anything old that belonged to Grandpa?" I smiled warmly and told her we would look together over the weekend. Her excitement reminded me that children often discover truths adults overlook simply because they are willing to ask honest questions. That evening Emily looked more exhausted than ever before. She quietly admitted to David that she had borrowed money from her emergency savings just to cover part of the overdue mortgage payment. "I do not understand how everything fell apart so quickly," she whispered. David looked at the growing pile of paperwork before answering. "Maybe nothing fell apart. Maybe someone had been holding everything together, and we never realized it." His words settled into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Emily looked at him without speaking, as though the idea itself felt impossible. I carried everyone's empty coffee cups back into the kitchen and quietly glanced toward the small wooden cottage where the brass key and the sealed envelope still waited inside the keepsake box. The answers my family desperately sought were resting only a few yards away, hidden not behind locked doors or secret vaults, but inside a lifetime of quiet sacrifices that no one had ever thought to notice. Saturday morning arrived with bright autumn sunshine spilling through the windows, offering a peaceful beginning that stood in sharp contrast to the quiet anxiety lingering inside the house. Emily and David left early to meet with their financial advisor, hoping someone outside the family could explain the mysterious disappearance of the payments that had quietly supported their lives for so many years. Before leaving, Emily kissed Sophie on the forehead and asked her to stay close to me while they were gone. Sophie happily agreed, reminding me about the family history assignment that was due the following week. After breakfast she followed me into my little cottage carrying an empty scrapbook and a notebook filled with questions about Grandpa. I smiled as she looked around the room with genuine curiosity, studying every old photograph and every carefully preserved keepsake as though each object held its own story. We spent nearly an hour looking through framed family pictures, laughing over memories of fishing trips, birthday celebrations, and Christmas mornings long before she had been born. Then Sophie noticed the small wooden keepsake box resting on the highest shelf beside my rocking chair. "Grandma," she asked softly, "what is inside that box?" I looked toward it for a long moment before answering. "Mostly memories." She grinned. "Can we use some of them for my school project?" I hesitated only briefly before lifting the box down from the shelf. The familiar brass key unlocked it with a gentle click that echoed through the quiet room. Inside rested several old family photographs, my husband's fountain pen, neatly bundled letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a stack of financial documents that had remained untouched for years. Sophie carefully picked up one photograph while I sorted through the papers beneath it. Suddenly a folded packet slipped from the bottom of the box and scattered across the floor. Sophie hurried to help gather everything before it became mixed together. As she reached for one of the pages, her eyes stopped on a long list of cancelled checks. "Grandma," she said innocently, "why does Mommy's name keep showing up on all these?" My heart grew still. I gently took the papers from her hands, but not before I noticed that several documents had already become visible. Mortgage payments. School tuition. Health insurance premiums. Each page carried the same trust account reference and the same recipient names that Emily and David had spent days trying to identify. Sophie looked at me with innocent confusion. "Did Grandpa help Mommy buy the house?" I smiled gently without answering the question directly. "Your grandfather loved this family very much," I said quietly. "Some people spend their whole lives planting trees whose shade they may never sit beneath." Just then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. Emily and David had returned home earlier than expected. Sophie gathered the scrapbook while I calmly placed most of the papers back inside the wooden box. One cancelled check, however, remained unnoticed beneath the edge of the rocking chair, its corner barely visible against the polished wooden floor as footsteps approached the front door. Emily carefully lowered herself into the chair beside the wooden keepsake box without taking her eyes off the documents spread across the table. David quietly gathered another bundle of cancelled checks, arranging them by date while Sophie stood silently beside me, sensing that something important was unfolding even if she could not yet understand it. The room remained almost completely silent except for the gentle turning of paper. Every page revealed another payment. Mortgage installment stretching back more than 15 years. Sophie's preschool tuition. Elementary school tuition. Health insurance premiums. Unexpected hospital invoices. Homeowners insurance. Property taxes. Each payment carried the same trust account identification and the same careful record-keeping. Emily slowly looked toward me, her voice trembling with confusion. "Mom, why would you have all of this?" Before I could answer, the telephone resting on the side table began to ring. I glanced at the caller identification and quietly answered. "Good afternoon, James." Emily immediately looked up. James Porter spoke calmly from the other end of the line. "Mrs. Wilson, I believe it would be best if I came over this afternoon. There are questions that deserve complete answers." I thanked him and ended the call. Emily looked between me and the telephone. "James Porter? Our family attorney?" I nodded gently. "Yes." Less than an hour later James arrived carrying the familiar cream-colored folder I had seen so many times over the years. He greeted everyone politely before placing the folder on the dining table. No one sat comfortably anymore. The truth had become too large for ordinary conversation. James slowly opened the folder and removed several neatly organized documents. "Emily," he began kindly, "your mother asked me to keep these records confidential until circumstances made it appropriate to reveal them." Emily stared at him without speaking. James continued. 15 years ago, shortly after your father retired, he and your mother established a private family trust. The purpose of that trust was very simple. They wanted to quietly support your family whenever help was needed without making you feel dependent or embarrassed. Emily's face slowly lost all color. James carefully placed another document before her. "Since that day, every monthly mortgage payment on your home has been made through that trust. Your daughter's education has been paid through the same account. Your health insurance premiums, several unexpected medical expenses, and numerous household emergencies were also covered by those distributions." David leaned forward, reading each page with growing disbelief. "Every one of these payments?" he whispered. James nodded. Every one of them. Emily looked at me with tears beginning to fill her eyes. You paid for all of this? I smiled gently and shook my head. Your father and I planned it together. After he passed away, I simply honored the promise we made. James quietly removed one final document from the folder. Last week Mrs. Wilson signed an amendment. She did not remove you as the beneficiary. She did not reduce your inheritance. She only instructed that the monthly support payments should finally come to an end. The room fell completely silent. Emily slowly lowered her head into her hands as every conversation about burdens, expenses, and assisted living returned to her memory with painful clarity. For the first time she understood that the person she believed had been depending on her had quietly carried her entire family for nearly half of her adult life. No one moved for what felt like several minutes. Emily remained seated with both hands covering her face while tears slipped silently through her fingers. David stared at the documents scattered across the table as though every page erased a belief he had carried for years. Sophie quietly walked to my side and slipped her small hand into mine without saying a single word. Children often understand the language of hearts long before adults do. James Porter carefully closed the cream-colored folder and rose from his chair. Before leaving, he looked toward Emily with quiet compassion. Your parents never wanted gratitude. They only wanted your family to feel secure. Every payment was made in complete confidence because they believed love should remove burdens, not create them. He gently shook David's hand, nodded respectfully to me, and quietly walked out the front door, leaving behind a silence that no one knew how to break. Emily slowly stood and walked toward the kitchen window where she could see my little cottage beneath the old maple tree. For years she had believed it was simply a modest place where her widowed mother stayed because there was nowhere else to go. Now she realized that the woman living there had quietly sacrificed her own comfort so her daughter could keep the larger home, raise her family without financial fear, and believe every dream had somehow worked itself out. She turned toward me with eyes filled not only with sorrow but with shame. Mom, she whispered, struggling to find the words, all those times, when I complained about money, when I thought. Her voice disappeared. I slowly walked across the room and gently held her trembling hands. You were carrying responsibilities that felt heavy, I said softly. I never blamed you for being tired. Emily shook her head through tears. No. I called you a burden. I talked about assisted living while you were paying our mortgage. I believed I was taking care of you. I smiled with the same quiet warmth I had carried throughout all those years. Every parent hopes that one day their children will have an easier life than they did. Your father and I were simply blessed to help make that possible. David stepped closer, his own eyes moist with emotion. Why did you never tell us? I looked toward the old photographs resting inside the open keepsake box. Because kindness that asks to be noticed slowly becomes a transaction instead of a gift. Your father believed the greatest blessings are the ones that arrive so quietly people mistake them for ordinary life. Sophie wrapped both arms around my waist. Grandma, does this mean Grandpa has still been taking care of us? I knelt beside her and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. In a way, yes. Love does not disappear when someone leaves this world. Sometimes it continues through the promises they leave behind. Emily suddenly embraced me with both arms, holding me tighter than she had in many years. She cried without trying to hide her tears, repeating the same words again and again. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I closed my eyes and quietly held my daughter, knowing that forgiveness had already entered the room long before she asked for it. The following morning felt unlike any other our family had ever experienced. Instead of rushing through breakfast while everyone hurried toward another busy day, we remained seated around the dining table long after the coffee had grown cold. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, almost reverent, as though every person present was quietly examining the years that had led us to this moment. Emily looked at me several times before finally speaking. Mom, I would like to ask you something, and I hope you will answer honestly." I nodded gently. "Of course." She folded her hands together. "How many dreams did you give up so we could keep ours alive?" I smiled softly before looking toward the window where the maple tree swayed gently in the autumn breeze. "More than I can count," I answered. "But I never thought of them as dreams I lost. I thought of them as gifts I was fortunate enough to give." Emily lowered her eyes again. "You could have traveled. You could have moved into a larger home. You could have enjoyed your retirement." I reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "Your father and I already enjoyed the greatest reward we ever wanted. We watched our daughter build a family filled with love. Everything else was simply extra." David quietly stood from his chair and walked outside without saying a word. A few minutes later he returned carrying a toolbox and several gardening gloves. "Mrs. Wilson," he said with a warm smile, "I noticed the fence behind your cottage needs repairing. I thought perhaps we could work on it together today." I laughed softly. "It has only been leaning for 6 months." David smiled for the first time in many days. "Then I suppose I am 6 months late." Sophie immediately volunteered to help, proudly carrying small flower pots toward the garden while Emily followed behind with fresh mulch and watering cans. Throughout the afternoon our family worked side by side beneath the old maple tree. We repaired loose boards, planted autumn flowers, cleaned the porch, and repainted the little wooden bench where my husband and I had once spent countless evenings watching the sunset. No one treated the work as an obligation. It became something far more meaningful. It was our first opportunity to give back, even if only in small ways, to the woman who had quietly given so much for so long. As the sun slowly dipped below the trees, Emily carried 2 rocking chairs onto the porch of my cottage. She placed one beside mine exactly where my husband's chair had once stood. Then she sat beside me without speaking. After several peaceful minutes she whispered, "I spent years believing I was responsible for carrying this family. Today I realized I was standing on shoulders that never asked to be seen." I looked toward the golden sky, remembering the countless evenings my husband and I had dreamed about the future of our family. "The strongest foundations are usually the ones hidden beneath the house," I replied. Emily rested her head gently against my shoulder, just as she had done when she was a little girl. Across the yard Sophie laughed while chasing colorful maple leaves with David, and for the first time in many years I felt certain that the greatest inheritance my husband and I had protected was finally beginning to bloom inside the hearts of the people we loved most. Over the next several weeks our family slowly settled into a new rhythm, one built not upon hidden sacrifices but upon shared gratitude. Emily insisted that I move back into the main house, explaining that my little cottage had always been meant as a peaceful retreat rather than a place where I should live alone. I smiled and thanked her, but I gently declined. "Your father built that cottage with his own hands," I reminded her. "Every board carries one of his dreams. I still feel him there every morning when the sun rises through the east window." Emily nodded with quiet understanding. Instead of trying to change my mind again, she simply made certain I never ate breakfast alone unless I wanted to. Nearly every morning she arrived carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee before work, and we spent a few peaceful minutes talking about ordinary things that had once been crowded out by worry. David no longer treated repairs around my cottage as postponed weekend chores. He replaced loose porch steps, repaired the garden gate, installed brighter lights along the walkway, and carefully restored the old rocking chair my husband had built decades earlier. Each project became his quiet way of saying thank you without repeating the words endlessly. Sophie continued visiting after school almost every afternoon. Together we finished her family history assignment, filling the scrapbook with photographs, handwritten memories, and stories about Grandpa's quiet generosity. Her teacher later told Emily it was one of the most heartfelt family projects she had ever read. One evening Sophie proudly showed me the final page she had added herself. Written in careful handwriting were the words, "Real heroes do not always wear uniforms. Sometimes they quietly pay the bills so other people can keep dreaming." I felt tears gather in my eyes as I hugged her tightly. The following Sunday our family gathered at the small church where my husband and I had worshipped for many years. After the service Emily asked if we could stop by the cemetery before going home. We carried fresh flowers together through the peaceful rows until we reached my husband's resting place beneath a tall oak tree. Emily knelt quietly beside the headstone and gently placed the bouquet against the polished granite. She remained there for several moments before speaking through quiet tears. "Dad, I finally understand what you and Mom were trying to teach me. I wish I had learned it sooner." David rested one hand gently on her shoulder while Sophie stood beside me holding my hand. A soft autumn breeze moved through the oak branches above us, scattering a few golden leaves across the grass. As we prepared to leave, Emily looked toward me with a peaceful smile that had been absent for many years. "Mom," she said softly, "I spent half my life believing success meant earning enough money to protect my family. Now I understand that true security begins with people willing to love without expecting applause." I smiled at my daughter's words, knowing they would have filled my husband's heart with quiet joy. The greatest lesson he had left behind had finally reached the people it was always meant to transform, and from that day forward our family no longer measured wealth by what rested inside bank accounts but by the kindness we quietly placed inside one another's lives. Nearly a year passed before I fully understood how completely our family had changed. The seasons turned quietly, carrying the maple tree from brilliant autumn gold through winter snow and into the fresh green promise of spring. Life no longer revolved around hidden financial support or painful misunderstandings. Instead, it became centered on something far more valuable. We had finally learned to see one another clearly. Emily no longer measured success by promotions, larger paychecks, or the endless pressure to prove herself. She began leaving work earlier whenever possible, choosing family dinners over late meetings and peaceful evenings on the porch over unnecessary overtime. David often joked that repairing my cottage had become his favorite weekend hobby, although I knew the projects had long since stopped being about the cottage itself. They were his quiet way of honoring the man whose generosity had shaped his family without ever asking for recognition. Sophie continued growing into the thoughtful young woman her grandfather would have admired. For her next birthday she asked for something no one expected. Instead of expensive gifts, she requested that everyone choose one family in the community who might quietly need help without feeling embarrassed to ask for it. Together we anonymously paid a month's rent for a widowed neighbor, repaired the porch of an elderly veteran, and purchased school supplies for several children whose parents had fallen on difficult times. No one signed their names. No one waited for thank you letters. We simply smiled at one another, knowing exactly where the idea had begun many years earlier. One peaceful Saturday afternoon Emily walked with me beneath the old maple tree carrying the familiar wooden keepsake box. She placed it gently on the porch between our rocking chairs before opening it one final time. The brass key rested exactly where it always had beside my husband's fountain pen and the faded family photographs. Emily carefully lifted the sealed white envelope that had remained untouched since James had delivered it months before. "Mom," she asked softly, "may I keep these one day?" I smiled warmly. "One day they will all belong to you." She shook her head gently. "Not because they are valuable. Because I never want our family to forget what they represent." I reached inside the box and placed the brass key into her hand. "Then it belongs with you now." She looked at the old key for a long moment before closing her fingers around it. Tears quietly filled her eyes once again. "I used to think this story was about discovering who paid our bills," she whispered. "Now I know it was never about the money." I nodded gently. "No. It was always about discovering who never stopped believing in you, even when you forgot how to believe in one another." As the evening sun settled behind the trees, Emily rested her head against my shoulder exactly as she had done when she was a little girl. The porch remained quiet except for the gentle creak of our rocking chairs and the soft breeze moving through the maple branches overhead. Looking across the yard toward the home where laughter now echoed more often than worry, I realized my husband's greatest gift had never been the trust, the canceled checks, or the inheritance waiting in legal documents. His greatest gift was teaching the next generation that the sweetest form of love is the kind that gives without seeking recognition, forgives before being asked, and leaves behind hearts that become richer long after every dollar has been spent.